And as I was preparing this week for the study, I came across a quote by Warren Wiersbe about this chapter. I just wanted to share it with you. You cannot control what people do to you, but you can control what you do with God. And that was his note on 1 Samuel 19. You cannot control what people do to you, but you can control what you do with God. And one of the things that we're going to learn in 1 Samuel 19, this is the beginning of a long, dry period in David's life. David has been promoted from being the youngest of 8 brothers and a shepherd and a nobody to a leader in Saul's army. Now, the story of Goliath and David has begun to be one of the most popular people in Israel among Saul's servants and among the people in the kingdom. And you probably know the answer to this, but why was David so popular in this time of his life? When he had been anointed king, but was not yet sitting on the throne. Remember the phrase that we looked at last week that was mentioned at least 3 times in 1 Samuel 18? What was it? David behaved himself wisely. That is, he acted in a way that would not bring reproach on him. He wasn't out there bad-mouthing Saul all the time. And he wasn't bad-mouthing his brothers and his circumstances and life. He was out there behaving himself wisely. Whatever the king, Saul, asked him to do, he did. And I would imagine that he did it cheerfully. There's a lot in the life of David that we're going to learn as we go through the rest of this book and the book of 2 Samuel. That we'll understand as we go through this why the Bible says David was a man after God's own heart. Doesn't mean that David was perfect. He was far from that. And if you mention David's name, what's the first thing that people usually associate with David when you mention his name? Bathsheba. His affair with Bathsheba, his arranging the murder of Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, and being exposed by the prophet. We talk about that we remember David, but when God looks at David, he was a righteous man. As he looks at you and me, by the way, he doesn't look at our failures. He doesn't look at our shortcomings. But he looks at us as being righteous in Christ. And by the way, how much more righteous can you get than Jesus? You can't. And that's the way God sees you. So as we study chapter 19, things are going to begin to turn in David's life. He's not going to be welcomed in Saul's house anymore. Saul is going to turn out now to be an enemy of David. And at every turn would have nothing better to do than to kill David. And that becomes his life mission now, to destroy David, simply because he was jealous. And as we get into chapter 19, remember that David had just married Saul's daughter, Michal. And Saul thought he was setting David up to be killed by the Philistines because David was from a poor family in Israel. And David could not afford to pay the dowry for a king's daughter. The king being the highest person in the nation, the dowry for his daughters would probably have been very high. And y'all remember what dowry was. What is dowry in the Old Testament? Alimony in advance. That the man had to pay the family of the bride to marry her. Now, I wonder how many men would pursue marriage today if they had to pay a bride price. Well, some of us have found brides that are worth the price and would have paid it. But it would cause a lot of men to stop and think about the step that they're about to take. So the king said, well, let's not let that be a problem. I'll tell you what, give me the foreskins of 100 Philistines, and that'll be a dowry. And of course, he thought that David would be killed in that exercise. And David went one up on Saul. He brought in 200. And Michal was given to David as his wife. And Saul knew that the Lord was with David. So now into chapter 19. Saul also knew that his son Jonathan was in a very close friendship with David. In fact, the two had made a covenant together. And now in chapter 19, Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all his servants that they should kill David. So now he's trying to bring Jonathan and everybody else into his plot to kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, my father seeks to kill you. Therefore, please be on your guard until morning and stay in a secret place and hide. And here Jonathan shows himself to be a true friend. He could have just sat back and said, I'm not getting involved in that. Not my business. He didn't try to agree with Saul, but he could have just said, I'm not only going to disagree with him, I'm just not going to get involved in it. But what does he do? He goes and tells David that Saul is seeking to kill him, and that he should be on his guard until morning. Now just mark that, because David will be on his guard now for the next 20 years. He's been anointed the king of Israel, but for the next 20 years, he will be a man on the run, a fugitive, if you will, from the law. And Saul would not leave any stone unturned trying to find David to kill him. And so now he tries to draw Jonathan in, but Jonathan is not going to have any part of it, so he goes and tells David what his father is planning to do. Now, if anybody had anything to lose in all of this, who would it have been? Jonathan. He was the heir apparent. The throne would have been his. And he understood that David would be the rightful king. And so now he shows his loyalty to David. And he tells him that his father has got a death threat out on him. So he tells him to be on his guard until morning and stay in the secret place and hide. How true those words are going to be in the life of David for the foreseeable future. That he will be on his guard, he will be in a secret place, and he'll be hiding. Now, many times we think that when we get in the will of God and we're doing what God wants us to do, that everything is going to be pleasant and good. Don't we often think that? Well, God, this is what you told me to do. This is what you want me to do. Look at the mess I'm in. Yeah, if you're really in this, why am I having such a hard time with this? And one of the things that I have to be cautious of in my own walk is not getting impatient with God. When God reveals his will and his way, there's always going to be a time of testing. Not so God can find out what we're made of, so we can find out what we're made of. And so David now, J. Vernon McGee says that he has entitled this section, David Disciplined. Now, before I get too far into this chapter, I want you to remember with me that David's training ground was where? Where did David learn to trust the Lord? As a shepherd, out there watching the sheep, doing a meaningless job, probably a job that he did not get a lot of attaboys for. It amuses me today that we look at the fact that people aren't going to be good workers unless they're continuously stroked. That is, oh, you're doing such a good job. You're doing such a fantastic, that motivates us to do a good job. Well, what about our serving the Lord? Shouldn't that be the greatest motivating force that we have? Whether or not anybody ever notices or anybody ever says anything about it. You know, that we ought to be, whatever we do, Paul said to the Colossians, whatever we do it heartily as unto the Lord. Because from the Lord, we're going to receive our reward. So David learned faithfulness, and he learned trust, and he learned worship, and he learned to know God in an insignificant, unnoticed place. And oftentimes, that's the way God deals with you and me. That he puts us in insignificant places where we're unnoticed, so that during those times we learn to trust him. And I think some of David's greatest songs came from sitting out there just watching the sheep, looking at the stars, protecting the sheep from the bears and the wolves and the thieves. And I think something just happened in David's heart. It's sort of like, you and I sit at home, we wonder what's going on, what do we need to be doing? And maybe that's the time God begins to plant a song in our heart. And I know we'll get to it to the end of the chapter, but this is a chapter where we know one of the psalms that came from David's heart came during this time. And I'll tell you what it is at the very end, unless you have a study Bible that tells you what psalm David wrote. So David now is being encouraged by Jonathan to go to a place where he can hide. Verse 3, and I will go out, and I'll stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you, and then what I observe I will tell you. Thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father. Two things I want you to notice about that. First of all, if Saul was going to kill David, what do you think he would have done to Jonathan if he took David's side? I mean, you got to understand, the king is not like a president. The king's rule and word was final. And if Saul said, kill David, then Jonathan said, I'm on David's side. Then he was placing his own life in his own hands at this point, even though he was the king's son. So this is one thing I want you to notice, that he didn't have any regard to his own safety at this point. The second thing I want you to notice is that he interceded on David's behalf, even though it would appear to have been illegal, against the king's rule. But he intercedes. And think about somebody you could intercede for as we look at this. So he speaks to his father, verse 4. Don't let the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good toward you. For he took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine. Now who would that have been? Goliath. and the Lord brought a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and you rejoiced. He's reminding his dad that when David killed the giant and God gave a great victory, that Saul was exalted. I mean, he was excited about that. He rejoiced in it. He saw what happened. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without a cause? So he intercedes for his friend, goes and asks his dad to reconsider. Now, fortunately, in verse 6, Saul did at this point. Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, "As the Lord lives, he shall not be killed." So Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these things, and Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as he was in the times past. And in the process of time, there was war again. And David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a mighty blow, and they fled from him. Now the distressing spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with a spear in his hand, and David was playing music with his. This distressing spirit from the Lord. You know, we've come across this a couple of times with Saul. It's almost like God sending an evil spirit, to plague Saul. And it's more like God has removed the safety barriers around Saul, and he is being attacked by these oppressive spirits. But this attack from this oppressive spirits comes from within Saul's own jealousies. They come back from war. David wins a mighty victory. And just like in our lesson last week, we talked about the two men with the different things that were in their hands. Remember what they were? In chapter 18, David had a harp, and a harp was an instrument of worship and of healing because it brought comfort to Saul. Saul had what in his hand? A javelin, which is an instrument of war and of pain. And in our lives, we too can hold a spear in our hand. And as John Corson says, you get the point. We drive the point home, because we want to have it our way. And just a comparison between what two men have. And I would rather be the one who had the instrument of worship in my hands, the instrument of healing. And we see it again in verse 9 as this jealousy begins to rise in Saul. He sits in his house with a spear in his hand, and David was playing music with his hand. Then Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence, and he drove the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped. This will be the last time David will see the palace until he is anointed king. So he flees now, knowing that Saul really is out to get him. Now, I think that in verse 10, there's a little bit of divine providence and protection in that. Maybe the Lord just, when Saul threw that javelin, just goes, and it slides right by him and pins into the wall. Maybe God gave David some ninja moves there, and he saw the spear coming and just got out of the way. But I believe this is God's divine protection over David, and that God is protecting him from the attacks of the enemy. The reason I say that is you and I are constantly being attacked by the enemy. And God has given us protection from the enemy. Jesus said to Peter, Satan has desired to have you and sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. And so if nothing else, we have the intercession of Christ, but we have the divine hand of God. And so even in the protection of David at this point, where the spear missed and he slipped away from Saul's presence, even now the hand of God is guiding Saul. Saul also sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. So not only did David escape from the palace, but now Saul actually sent soldiers to his house. And we're going to catch him. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, "If you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed." David did well to receive the warning from his wife. Sometimes men can be so hard-headed and hard-hearted that they never hear how God might warn them through their wives. And I may not always look like I do, but when my wife speaks about something in my life, I listen. I pay attention. I don't know but what that may be the Lord, trying to get my attention through my wife. So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. This is great. Here he is, the king, being let down in a window and having to run away at night because the king wants to kill him. Keep your finger there and turn to the book of Psalms. Psalm 59. And notice the title of Psalm 19. 59, I'm sorry, Psalm 59. To the chief musician, set to do not destroy, a miktam of David when Saul sent men and they watched the house in order to kill him. So we know that what we just read about in 1 Samuel is the occasion of this song. That David writes a song. And what he does, and I thought about reading the entire psalm, but I'll let you read through it. I've read through it a couple of times, just thinking about David being on the run for his life now, and Saul trying to lay a trap. How many of us would sing praise to the Lord during that time? How do I know it's a praise song? Well, look at verses 16 and 17. But I will sing of your power. Yes, I will sing aloud of your mercy in the morning. For you have been my defense and my refuge in the day of my trouble. To you, O my strength, I will sing praises, for God is my defense, my God of mercy. And you can go back and read the whole psalm where David, man, he's being let out of a window and he's on run for his life. He says, man, I'm going to worship the Lord. I'm going to pray. I'm going to sing praises unto the Lord. Now, I don't know about you, but there's a real lesson in that for us. Because as I said at the beginning, that quote from Warren Wiersbe, you cannot control what people do to you, but you can control what you do with God. David had no control over what Saul was doing. In fact, even his wife at this point was helping him. And his wife was on his side at this time. But David understood and recognized that the Lord was the one who was defending him. Sort of reminds me of something we see in the New Testament when a couple of guys get arrested at night and are beaten. And are sitting in a jail cell, with their backs torn open from a whip. And don't think of a clean prison cell like you'd see today. Well, they may not be that clean, but you don't think of a prison cell that you'd see today. This is dark and dirty and damp with no lights, and they're bleeding and they're chained and they can't even, do anything with their wounds. And at midnight, it says Paul and Silas, begin to do what? Sing praises unto the Lord. Maybe you and I are going through circumstances over which we have no control. And they are not pleasant. And we can't change the situation that we're in. Remember what Warren Wiersbe says, you cannot control what people do to you, but you can control what you do with God. So like David, like Paul and Silas, and like hundreds of thousands of saints through the ages who have done the same thing, the 21 Coptic Christians that were marched down the beach by the ISIS terrorists and beheaded there on the beach were singing hymns. Read Fox's Book of Martyrs. Listen to what Mary shares with us on Voices from the Martyrs. That there's something about the depth of our trial that brings the purest praise. I don't know what I would do, how I'd respond if ever there were a severe price to pay for following the Lord. But I would like to think that I am preparing myself now for when that time comes. That's why for me, when I listen to music now, as much as there is a pull to listen to some of the songs I listened to when I was growing up, that I still love, those aren't going to help me in the day of trouble. But when I can sing that song, oh, praise the name of the Lord our God, like we sang a while back. Wasn't it Sunday we sang that? Yeah, I think of that, if I'm singing that when things are going well, and I'm not having all the pressures of life, and I'm learning now to sing my worship songs to the Lord. That's why David could write Psalm 59 when the soldiers were hiding to arrest him and kill him. And he could write a song of praise that he would sing to God because he had learned when the things were going well that that's what he ought to be spending his time doing. Does that make sense, guys? When life is not hard, and I can't remember too many times in our lives where life has not been hard. You just kind of change the people and change the circumstances a little bit, and life gets hard. But there are other times where it is extremely hard. And you can't see, you can't see because it's so dark. That's when a song needs to rise up in our hearts. And that's why I encourage you. Didn't I ask you a couple of weeks ago? I'm getting, my memory is not what it used to be, to write down how many did I tell you to write? 10. Your top 10 worship songs, praise songs that you like. I'm not going to ask you to do that. It'd be nice to see what your list is. I'd like to see what you think would be your top worship songs. But those 10 songs that you think are your top worship songs, you ought to learn the words to those songs. You ought to be able to sing them, without the words up here because you've listened to them over and over again. I love to turn on praise music. And, I'm slowly catching up with technology. Some technology I like. Other parts of technology I could just do without. I've given up electronic calendars and all that stuff, and I've gone back to the old-fashioned paper. It works better for me. But Spotify I like. And on Spotify, based on what your playlists are, there's a new playlist they'll put out every week. You know what it is? It's called Songs Sang Last Sunday. It's a playlist that Spotify creates. And I was reading a little bit about it, and what they've done is they've partnered with CCLI. CCLI, I don't know if you notice when we do the overhead, there's always that little writing in the bottom of the screen. Every church has to have a license to display that song. And we pay our money every year. That's the little way the songwriters get paid. Every time their song is displayed, that's recorded. But what Spotify has done is they've partnered with CCLI, and they create a playlist of the most sung songs on the previous Sunday. I think that's pretty cool, So I listen to it. Some of it, since Angela and I have, for as long as we've been married, gone to sleep with music on at night. It's kind of hard to go to sleep with some of that upbeat Hillsong, Bethel, Just an hour, yeah. We have a timer set up. We have a timer set on this. It goes off after an hour. But usually, true confession here, Angela, I usually don't make it through the first song. I've never been awake when the music's cut off. We lay our head on the pillow at night, we pray, and then we're gone. But, some of those songs, they're very upbeat, and not the thing I kind of want to lay there and listen to as I'm drifting off into sleep. But you think about that. Yeah, and our time's getting away here, but think of the place of worship when things are going well. That's why in verse 12, when Michal let David down through a window and he went and fled and escaped, he immediately wrote a song about his trust in the Lord, that God was his defense, and that he would sing praises to the Lord. So if you like to write in your Bible, by verse 12 there, you might want to write Psalm 59. And David would also write of singing a song in the night. I was also reading a commentary this week, and I can't remember who the commentary was, what person it was, but he said that he was quoting Spurgeon, Charles Spurgeon. And he said Spurgeon believed that David wrote Psalm 119, which is the longest of all the Psalms. And Spurgeon believed that David wrote Psalm 119 in this period of persecution where Saul was chasing him. Well, let's get back to our story here. You see the place of worship. Take your top 10 list. And if you want to, email it to me or let me have your top 10 list. I'd love to see what you consider to be your top favorite worship song. We might even try to include them in the mix here. Before I leave that, there's a lot of worship songs today, though, that really aren't worship songs. A wise pastor said something that the pastors have been discussing for the last couple of weeks. I'm on a list with about 1,000 different Calvary Chapel pastors, and we'll throw questions out there, and everybody will respond to it. And one of the questions that's been out there for a couple of weeks now is, with the bad doctrine of Bethel and with some of the things going on in Hillsong, what should we do with the worship music that comes out of Bethel and the worship and Jesus culture and Hillsong, seeing that their doctrine and their practices are beginning to stray a little bit from the scriptures, and Hillsong guys coming out even denying they believe in Jesus. Now, what should we do with their worship songs? And one of the guys made a great point. He says, if we go back and look at all the hymns that we revere today and look at the theology of the church at that time, we would say, I don't know if I want to buy into that or not. But the point I was going to make is that one of the guys says, I think any worship song that could have been understood 100 years ago is worthy to be sung in worship today. But if somebody 100 years ago wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about, then maybe that's not a good worship song. And I've begun to kind of use that litmus test a little bit in my top 10. Of course, y'all probably know what some of my top 10 songs are. And the song we just sang Sunday, the one I like so much, "Oh, praise the name of the Lord my God." Well, he's the guy who said, "I don't believe anymore." The guy who wrote it said, "I don't believe anymore." So do you throw the song out because the guy says, "I don't believe anymore"? And, but anyway, look at what you're worshiping with now. Because when things are relatively calm, and they may be, somewhat uncalm right now, but when we're going through a period of relative calm, do we tend to lean toward worship, or do we fill ourselves up with something else? Because when the times become troubled, and they will, and maybe they are now, and maybe they'll be more troubled, then what we're planting today will be what I'm harvesting tomorrow. And if I'm going around singing, "I can't get no satisfaction today," then when the trouble comes, guess what? I ain't getting no satisfaction. And I don't know. I don't want to get on my soapbox about that, but I think as worshipers, we try to relegate that to 15 or 20 minutes on a Sunday morning or a couple of songs on Wednesday night, and the rest of the time is mine to do with what I want. Well, when the time comes and our life is on the line and we're being let down through a window and running away for our lives, what's coming out? John Corson says we're a lot like a tube of toothpaste. You squeeze it, and when you squeeze it, you see what comes out. And when you and I get squeezed, we see what comes out. Well, this is a short chapter, so let me just go ahead and move on for just a minute. So Michal took an image and laid it in the bed, verse 13, and put a cover of goat's hair for his head and covered it with clothes. And Saul sent messengers to take David, and she said, "He's sick." So Saul sent messengers back to see David, saying, "Bring him up to me in the bed that I can kill him." This is the same guy who in verse 6 says, "As the Lord lives, he's not going to be killed." Now David says, "Bring him up." Saul says, "Bring him up here, I'll kill him myself." And the messengers had come in there. There was an image in the bed with a cover of goat's hair for his head. And Saul said to Michal, "Why have you deceived me like this and sent my enemy?" And this is when he's referring to David now as his enemy, "so that he's escaped." And Michal said, "He said to me, 'Let me go. Why should I kill you?'" So she's just trying to appease the wrath of her father at this point. So David fled, and he escaped and went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done. And he and Samuel went and stayed at Naioth. Now Samuel was old at this time, but David sought him out. Not only because he was the one who anointed him, but I believe he sought him out because he was a man of God. And he wanted encouragement from the man of God. And it was told to Saul, verse 19 says, "Take note, David is at Naioth in Ramah." And Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the group of prophets prophesying and Samuel standing as a leader over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. Now, this word in the Hebrew for prophesy is a little different than the normal word that we'd see for prophecy. This Hebrew word probably would be more like a praise than a prophecy. So it's like Samuel was leading a worship service. They were all worshiping the Lord, declaring the good works of God, and these guys come in, all of a sudden the Spirit falls on them, and they start worshiping the Lord. And so when Saul, verse 21, was told, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. Then Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they also prophesied. It must have been a tremendous worship service. That when everybody walked in, man, they just thought the Spirit would begin. I believe this is part of the divine protection, by the way, of David. God can do, in fact, I jotted this down. I thought this was great. A person can be affected by the power of God, resulting in an amazing experience, but not surrendered to the power of God, which results in a changed life. A person can be affected by the power of God, resulting in amazing experiences, but not surrendered to the power of God, which results in a changed life. And I believe that's what we're seeing here. That they are experiencing the presence of the Lord, but they're not surrendering to the power of the Lord. So, verse 22, Saul himself went to Ramah and came to the great well that is in Shechem. And so he asked and said, "Where are Samuel and David?" And someone said, "They are indeed at Naioth and Ramah." So he went there to Naioth and Ramah. And the Spirit of God was also upon him too. And he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah. And he stripped off his clothes and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and lay down naked all day and all night. The one thing I thought was interesting, I read another commentary, and on this verse he said, we have people today that give all kinds of evidences for being filled with the Spirit, but this is not one you hear. I got filled with the Spirit, so I'm going to strip off my clothes and as a sign of being Spirit-filled. But again, this is again Saul responding to the power of God, but not surrendering to the power of God. And many people believe this was the same spot where back in chapter 10, it says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Saul. Remember when he first became king? And he prophesied? Well, many believe this is the same spot. And it was God's conviction coming upon Saul at this point for the failure to live a surrendered life. And yet at that time, he still sung his praises unto the Lord. Well, let me encourage you this week as we wrap up, that you find a place of worship wherever you are in your personal walk. And not only let it be an amazing experience, but it be a place of surrender to the will of God. And then when the hard times do come, or the harder times come, we have prepared ourselves in this season to worship the Lord. And I'll close with this. I've said it probably 500 times, so let me make it 501. That everything that happens in our lives is another opportunity for us to learn to trust the Lord. So in my good times and in my calm times, I am learning to trust the Lord. Amen? So in the harder times, what I have planted in begins to come out. Because believe it, folks, we will reap the harvest of what we're planting today. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you that